Okay, so this is part two of my older adult oral video presentation, and this slide discusses the psychosocial crisis resolution. So we know that early relationships are important when considering biopsychosocial events. My interviewee did not have a great relationship with her biological father, but she did have a very good relationship with her stepfather. So she also had good relationships with the women in her life, her mother, her grandmother, and also with her older brothers who looked after her. My interviewee's social class today would be defined as middle class or upper class. But she began in an era of, poverty for her family. But what she learned was that resourcefulness was an option for her. She watched her mother and grandmother be very resourceful. She learned to decide what gifts she had, and she used them. Her family at the time obviously was affected by Jim Crow laws, and these were laws that didn't allow for African Americans to live in certain neighborhoods. These laws enforced segregation for public schools, phone booths, hospitals, jails, residential homes for the elderly and handicapped. Public parks were forbidden for African Americans to enter. They couldn't go into theaters, restaurants were also segregated. So there were segregated waiting rooms and buses and train stations, water fountains, restrooms, building entrances, elevators, cemeteries, even amusement park cashier windows. So her family obviously came through all of this. And of course, that was how to navigate that was passed down to her. Her family also came through the Great Depression. That was between 1929 and 1939. That was a period that would have affected my interviewee's family, and would have been passed down to her some of those coping skills. My interviewee chose not to have children. She had an incident where she witnessed her aunt, who was having baby number 10, and was screaming to be put to death. And she thought, why would I want to do that? So she was impacted by that and made the decision not to have children. Some of the things that made a difference, that facilitated a resolution for this crisis stage, was like the NAACP. It was founded in 1909. And it was formed partially in response to the ongoing violence against African Americans around the country. The NAACP, or the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, is the oldest and largest civil rights organization in the United States. There was also things like affirmative action, and this was the intentional effort to improve employment, educational, and other opportunities for members of society that had been subjected to discrimination. So the criteria for affirmative action did include race, disability, gender identity, sexual orientation, ethnic origin, and age. So my client's grandmother was affected by all of this, as was my client, sort of inheriting some of these social crises. But my client's grandmother was the first Black woman to buy a brownstone in North Philadelphia at that time. And at that time, culture was very different in terms of access for people of color, access to travel, engagement, as I mentioned earlier. So, and although my client has no religion to speak of, she does believe in God as a supreme being. And in her words, she believes that he could be a he or a she. My client's educational background, post high school, she completed a real estate course and also attended Wharton School of Business program as a continuing education requirement from her job. She stated that her job paid for her to continue her education, so if she felt as if she had to go back to school and they were going to pay for it, that she was going to choose the very best. And so she often traveled for work also, and in those instances, again, they were often marked by racism where she would go out to eat, she wouldn't be served right away, she would be ignored, and she would have to speak up and say, I am here as a representation of this company, this financial institution has sent me. And then she would get the service that she needed. But when she would return to report back and train others on the information that she learned on these business trips, again, she would often be ignored or devalued as if what she had to say was not important. But she always stood proudly in her womanhood and in her blackness and got the job done. So this slide discusses the biopsychosocial factors or events that, again, facilitated or inhibited the resolution of the psychosocial crisis. And it talks about how oppression may have shaped some of her life experiences. Certainly being a person of color in the 50s through 80s was a time of revolution. My interviewee had to have a sense of fortitude that she learned from her family, again, from her background, from her upbringing. She lived through the deaths and riots ensuing from some of the greats like MLK and Malcolm X. My interviewee's life was marked by oppressive systems and experiences, but she grew from them, although she admits that there were times where she shed tears, but she used those experiences as stepping stones. And so this slide discusses the biopsychosocial factors or events that may have facilitated and or inhibited the resolution of the psychosocial crisis using the multisystem lens. So her family, of course, first was a very huge foundation for her. I'm going to focus on the social forces or policies that helped her. And so the end to Jim Crow laws was one, obviously, the NAACP, affirmative action, the Social Security system, which was designed to support all folks, although in its beginning it only supported, it didn't support people of color because people of color held domestic positions, and if you held a domestic position or you worked on a farm, you could not have access to it. But over time that Social Security system grew, and it includes today's welfare system. And then, of course, more equality for women and people of color, and then equity also in the education system. An additional theoretical perspective I chose that sheds light on aspects or phases of my interviewee's life is entitled Early and Midlife Predictors of Wisdom and Subjective Well-Being in Old Age. And this article explores the idea that wisdom in old age can be predicted by one successfully overcoming the crisis in varying stages of the life cycle, which we all just viewed in the previous slides. The concept includes the idea that growth and development in varying stages of early development have a direct effect on how folks feel as they age. The study is centered around early childhood well-being, having hallmarks of supportive family life, opportunities for exploration, emotional stability, and with the same opportunities in adolescence and early childhood, which we did see in my interviewee's life cycle. So looking at the article through the lens of Erickson, one can surmise also that mastering early stages of development are a combination of personality, access, awareness, resilience, perseverance, and opportunity, which is seen in the life of my interviewee. Now, this theory does have limitations, and so while the article did include nature versus nurture components for assessing individuals, it was a bit biased because the studies were completed on 60-year-old white males with Harvard educations. And this population doesn't represent all males or even most males, and it does exclude women. And so the assessments leave out social factors that may include culture, race, and societal norms for that time. And also the assessments were completed by different sets of judges for the outcomes related to early development, while the assessments regarding the outcome of wisdom were completed by the individuals themselves. And lastly, my conclusion slide, my references are from the Rogers text, and also the second theoretical perspective that I used can be found in the Journals of Gerontology, Series B, Psychological Sciences and Social Sciences. So thank you for listening and for watching my video. I hope you enjoyed it.